Brother Kevin Presley.
I'm not here, thank you, Jenny, but what I heard was just great. I know with types, we generally rely on scripture to make the connection for us that it is a type, but I'd be curious what you think, and you talked about this in a few minutes before I got here, just tell me something. What you think about referring to Joseph as a type? Because he's such a vivid parallel to Christ, probably is, but we don't have that connection that I'm aware of in the New Testament.
Thank you for that question. And, I appreciate you being here. And I did mention this early on that there's some guardrails that I feel comfortable with using to declare what something is a type. Now, it doesn't actually have to be declared type. It can use other words like example or shadow, things of that nature. So there are a couple of ways that the Bible explicitly makes it a type. So you've got the word type, and then you've got these other phrases. And then you've got an implicit way, which I think is the situation with Joseph. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is certainly making a connection to Joseph. And, we could go beyond that, but we could say there's so many things in the life of Joseph that meet up and measure up perfectly. He's the only one, incidentally, that I know of in any Bible character, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that nothing sinful is recorded about him. Not that he was sinless, but perhaps that is a connection God wanted to paint. And I don't think that Melchizedek was fatherless in that he was some alien being coming down, but he intended to omit that information for the sake of an impression.
David Griffin.
Jimmy, that was great. And unlike Kevin, I was here for the whole thing. And I'm always afraid to ask a question because I think, well, it's probably going to be something he covered. But I don't think he did. I don't know what to call it. It seems like I've heard it called prophetic typology or typical prophecy or something. But and I don't want to throw a curveball at you, and maybe some of these other guys, maybe like Doug Edwards or somebody, could also comment on this if they want to. But in Matthew, what is it? Matthew 1:15, I think it is. Yeah, Matthew 1:15. Matthew quotes from Hosea, chapter 11, in the words, "Out of Egypt I called my son." But then when you go back to Hosea chapter 11 and read chapter 11, it seems like he's talking about the nation of Israel when he called them out of Egypt under Moses. And so I kind of have a thought about that, but I'm just curious. Could you?
I can comment on it, and since you invoked Doug's name, I'm going to have him answer the question. But I will say before I think that kind of goes into the realm of, does prophecy have a double meaning? Is there such a thing? Is there a possibility for prophecy to have a double meaning? And I'll let Doug answer that question. But when it comes to typology and prophecy, there's some overlap and some similarity. Obviously, there's some prophetic nature to types, pointing forward. But during the time, and I guess prophecy is the same in that way. They don't always know that it's a prophecy until looking back. But I read one time where prophecy is more perspective, and typology is more retrospective, looking back on it. But I would say that Matthew 1 passage is more of a prophecy than there may be some typology aspects to it, but I don't know. I'll stop with that. Thank you for that.
You have a follow-up, David.
Do you have a follow-up, David?
Well,
Here you go. I thought I saw you were grabbing for the mic again. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, now that you put me on the spot, I'm sure I remember what my follow-up was. I guess my question was that when it looks like it's talking about Israel, the nation under Moses, then when Matthew applies it, he applies it to Christ. it seems like there's not a parallel there. I mean, we're talking about making a connection, using the scripture to make the connection. Well, Matthew obviously makes the connection, but then when you look at it, you go, well,
Right.
and I've just wondered if maybe, and I'm just throwing my theory out there, but it's just a thought, that maybe in that particular case, it's more of a matter of really, when Matthew quotes it, it's more literal of Christ than it is of Israel. Because Israel was a son metaphorically, but Jesus was literally his son. I don't know, maybe, and just there is a parallel there.
Sure.
But Matthew pulls that from, I don't know, just pulls that from Hosea. It just has always struck me as peculiar, frankly. That's my follow-up, whatever it's worth.
Jace Lee.
Wonderful job with it, Jimmy. I really enjoyed that. I'm gonna try my best to make this question make sense, because I think it's really important for young guys like me that are learning how to preach to understand this. So, my question is related to application from the Old Testament and the difference between that and typology. What I mean by that is, for instance, the cities of refuge. From all the commentators I've read, from the personal study I've done, it seems like Hebrews 6 and 18 is, like you said, an implicit allusion to the cities of refuge. How the manslayer, after he accidentally kills someone, would run to the city of refuge to be safe from the avenger of blood. We can make that connection. But many times, we'll make a connection and say the names of the cities. One of them means Bezer, which means fortress in the Greek or in the Hebrew. And we would say, well, Jesus is a fortress, just like the cities of refuge were a fortress. My question is, that's not mentioned as a type in Hebrews 6, right? The type is about running to refuge, how we run to Jesus. So would you say that's more of an application to say, just like Jesus is our refuge, the cities was, just my question is, how do we differentiate between making an application and a similarity and then making sure it's a type?
Well, that's a good question. I think we can be cautious in making the application by explaining that the scriptures do not explicitly make this connection, and there's things that we can apply to us. We just have to be careful not to stretch it beyond what is written. Now, if something is written, then it's helpful to make that connection. And I don't know all of the answers to how we can and should apply everything about this. Now, I think that in my own personal studies with people, I try to, when I study, I have a little series I go through with non-members called Gospel from Genesis, and you can really pull out a lot of foundational principles from there. Then you can also make some parallels, and certainly at times, like with Adam, you can talk about some foreshadowing that is, I think, unavoidable if you're looking at it. But just be cautious. Parables, the same way. We can stretch the parables, make the parable apply to something that kind of goes beyond the intent, and make it say more than that's eisegesis, when you're putting something into the text, and we want to try to avoid it. We want to exegete, and so it's a challenge sometimes, but we have to be careful. And I think the guardrails where, yes, the writers use the language and make the comparison, it's helpful. Just being careful.
Richard Butter.
I enjoyed your presentation. It was very good. Actually, I think my first talk at this study, which was in the last century, was on this very subject. And I found, people wanna say, read this, read that, I'll give you mine. Horn's introduction to the scriptures, speaks a lot about types, and Horn points out, you know, just exactly as you did, we need an inspired writer to identify. But then we need to identify that we understand what the type is, like, and I used in the last century that sometimes people talk about the Noah's Ark being a type of the church, but actually when you read what's recorded in 1 Peter chapter 3, he's saying that Noah's Ark was a type of baptism. And so baptism is the antitype of the ark. So it's important for us to identify, you know, what the antitype is. And so I'm going to go back now. You didn't present this, but you alluded to it, Colossians chapter 2. I believe if you read when Alexander Campbell debated with whatever his name was when he was there in Kentucky, Purcell, Campbell would disagree that circumcision is a type of baptism, and he would explain that the illusion there is that Jesus Christ was the type. I just throwing that out so you might, you know, examine
Sure.
that. It's important to identify the antitype, and then you understand the type better. Good talk though, I really like it, and this is a fascinating subject.
Yeah.
Sometimes people use things that, you know, I remember Foy Wallace in his book of sermons, he says an Old Testament example of a New Testament conversion, and he preaches about Naaman. The word example, you know, cannot be taken the same way that you presented it there, because I do not believe that that's a type of people obeying the gospel. It makes a great sermon, and most of us have preached something similar to that, but it's not a type, it's just an illustration of how salvation is. Thank you.
Thank you. I certainly agree that, you know, we all need to be humble about our approach with it, and be able to be able to stand corrected with it. And I'll look into that for sure, Colossians 2. You know, going back to 1 Peter, where Peter uses Noah as a type, he doesn't even use the ark as the type, he uses the water as the type. And that's interesting, because what saved Noah? You could say the ark, but Peter chooses to use the water as the type, the antitype, baptism, which is kind of a remarkable set of parallels in and of itself, the cleansing and the separation and so forth. Thank you.
Doug Edwards.
This is very good, Jim. I appreciate it. And I wasn't planning on saying anything this session. I guess I'll try to. And I don't know that I can clarify anything that has been mentioned on the passage in Matthew about Jesus, or about when they left Egypt, and they compared it to the passage in the book of Hosea. You know, I think Brother George Batty had this topic a few years ago. I can't remember exactly, maybe somebody can. I wish he were here to explain it, because I'm sure he can do it far better than I can. But I'm wondering, in the book of Matthew, since Matthew was written to the Jews, evidently, and there are several passages which indicate this was fulfilled according to Isaiah, or according to someone, that Matthew uses the concept of something being fulfilled perhaps in different ways. Sometimes he's referring to prophecy being directly filled, and sometimes he may be using it in the sense of types fulfilling a truth. And, you know, I'll throw those out, just think about it. If I'm wrong on it, I'll stand corrected. But I'm wondering if the passage in Matthew where Jesus is figuratively said to come out of Egypt is not a type. That in the book of Hosea, it was referring to Israel, and through inspiration, Matthew saw it as a type and referred it to Jesus. At least that's one possibility. I think another possibility is that there's the idea that Jesus is Israel. I don't know if we ever studied that statement very much. But he was the founder of a new nation, Israel. Jesus is Israel. Perhaps it can be fulfilled that way. One other thing that I did want to mention about the dual fulfillment of prophecy, double fulfillment of prophecy, I kind of think that's a dangerous thing to say that prophecy is fulfilled in two different ways or something. And the reason for that is because when we take that position that prophecy is fulfilled in dual ways, to me it opens a can of worms, because then you can start kind of applying it on your own to a different situation. The dispensationalists will use that. They will talk about passages referring to restoration of Israel from Babylonian captivity, and then they'll say there's a dual fulfillment of that, whereas Israel in 1949 or whatever year it was fulfilled, and that this prophecy in the Old Testament has a double fulfillment. You know, it's fulfilled originally in Old Testament times, now it's being fulfilled in latter days as well. So I really think it's kind of a dangerous thing to say prophecy is fulfilled in dual ways.
Thank you. Thank you for that input.
Any other questions for Brother Jimmy?
I could give one.
Brother Chris? Chris Freeman?
Thank you, Jimmy. That was really good. I had a question about a potential typology in Isaiah chapter 22. Hopefully I'm not catching you off guard. Eliakim, the servant. Some say that he is a type for Jesus, and some say he's a type for Peter, that being the Catholics, and then want to connect it to the papacy. And chapter 22, verse 22, he's given the key of the house of David. Can you speak about that for a moment? Or should I ask Doug?
You can ask Doug. I'm actually not prepared to answer that question. I have not looked into it in that application. So this is being recorded, and I don't want to just speak off the cuff.
Okay, thank you.
What can and will be held against me for
Jimmy, do you have any concluding remarks?
Well, I'll just say that whenever you present types that are intended by God to a skeptic, you're not merely quoting proof text, you're inviting them to see the fingerprints of God across the redemptive story. The Old Testament is not a backdrop to Jesus, it is a spotlight designed from eternity to shine on him. And I think we should use the whole counsel of God, as Jesus did from Moses and the prophets, to speak of him. And it's an amazing faith-building process to do so. Thank you for your listening.